The year was 1914. Across Europe, cities were still lit with gas lamps. Carriages still rolled through cobbled streets. But within months, the world changed forever. Millions of men were sent to the front lines, where battlefields stretched not over open plains, but into deep, muddy trenches. For years, these narrow ditches became home. Soldiers ate, slept, and fought in them, surrounded by mud, cold, and the distant thunder of artillery. Life in the trenches was not just a fight against the enemy, but a fight against nature itself, against rain that turned the ground into swamps, against rats and hunger, against fear and exhaustion. And yet, somehow they endured. They laughed when they could, shared rations with strangers, wrote letters home, and waited for mornings that felt endless. Tonight, in boring history for sleep, we'll walk quietly through those silent lines of earth and listen to the stories of how soldiers survived the trenches of World War I, not through glory, but through patience, companionship, and the fragile hope that someday it would end. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join us again for more calm journeys into the forgotten corners of history. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, few could imagine that it would turn the fields of Europe into a labyrinth of mud and misery. Soldiers marched off believing the war would be over by Christmas. They carried new uniforms, polished boots, and the kind of confidence that only the untested can have. But by the end of that year, the front lines had hardened into something unexpected. Long, deep trenches stretching from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. What began as open movement quickly sank into stillness. The trenches were not planned in the beginning. They were born from necessity. The invention of the machine gun, combined with modern artillery, made traditional battles impossible. Soldiers who tried to cross open ground were cut down in seconds. So they dug, first shallow holes for cover, then deeper lines for survival. What started as temporary shelters soon became permanent homes, fortified, expanded, and multiplied to be why early 1915, a vast network of trenches had formed across Western Europe. It was called the Western Front. From above, it looked like the scars of a great wound carved into the earth, twisting, turning, crisscrossing in endless patterns. Each side mirrored the other, frontline trenches facing one another across a barren strip of land known as no man's land. The front line was where soldiers lived and died. Behind it ran the support trenches, where supplies and reinforcements were stored. Farther back were reserve trenches, safer, quieter, used for rest and recovery. Communication trenches connected them all, zigzagging to prevent the blast of an explosion from traveling too far. Together, these lines formed an entire underground world, stretching hundreds of miles. Manned by millions that at first, the trenches were crude, hastily dug with spades and bayonets. The walls collapsed in the rain, the floors filled with water, and men huddled in the mud like ghosts. But as the months dragged on, the designs improved. Engineers were sent to reinforce them with timber, sandbags, and sheets of corrugated iron. Drainage ditches were added, duckboards laid on the floor to keep boots above the mud. Even so, the elements always won. Rain turned everything to sludge, and when the water froze, it became a new kind of misery. The process of digging was endless. Every day, soldiers were assigned to extend or repair the lines. Working by night to avoid snipers, they dug in silence. Only the scrape of shovels and the dull thud of earth breaking the stillness. The soil was heavy with clay and often filled with the roots of destroyed trees or fragments of old shells. Men worked waist-deep in mud, passing buckets of dirt from hand to hand, knowing that at any moment, an artillery shell could undo hours of labor that a typical trench was about 6 to 8 feet deep, just enough to protect a man standing upright. The walls were reinforced with wooden planks or woven branches, and sometimes with the bodies of sandbags stacked high. At intervals, fire steps were built, narrow ledges that allowed soldiers to climb up and peer over the parapet. Above the trench ran barbed wire, tangled and glinting in the gray light. Beyond that lay no man's land, a wasteland of shattered trees, shell holes, and silence broken only by the distant rumble of guns. Every trench had its own smell, a mix of earth, sweat, gunpowder, smoke, and decay. It was a scent that clung to uniforms, to boots, to the skin itself. Even when soldiers were rotated out of the line for rest, they carried that smell with them, a reminder that the front was never far away. Life inside the trenches was a rhythm of routine and unpredictability. Each man had a task: digging, carrying supplies, repairing wire, or standing watch. The monotony was broken only by sudden bursts of chaos. An artillery barrage, a sniper's shot, or the cry of gas that sent everyone scrambling for masks. Between those moments, time stretched endlessly. Soldiers cleaned their rifles, wrote letters home, shared quiet jokes, and waited. Always waiting. Building the trenches required constant innovation. In some areas, the water table was so high that deep digging was impossible. There, soldiers built sandbag walls above ground, creating breastworks rather than trenches. In other places, they carved into chalk hills or clay, forming dry, solid passages that offered rare comfort. Engineers experimented with drainage systems, constructing sumps, small pits filled with gravel where water could collect and be pumped out. Still, the mud returned after every storm. The trenches were not straight, but jagged. This zigzag pattern was deliberate. It prevented a single explosion or a burst of gunfire from traveling the full length of the line. Each section was a few yards long, connected by short turns, giving soldiers cover from direct fire. Behind the main trench were dugouts, small, low-ceiling shelters cut into the walls where men could sleep or escape shell fire. These dugouts varied from rough holes in the earth to elaborate bunkers lined with timber and furnished with candles, tables, and even stoves that it is hard to imagine how quickly this world became normal. Within months, entire armies adapted to life underground. Letters from the time speak of soldiers building small comforts, hanging photographs, carving shelves into the walls, even planting flowers or herbs near the trench edge during quieter seasons. Some regiments gave their sections nicknames: Suicide Alley, the Devil's Elbow, Happy Valley, a dark humor that helped them cope with the daily uncertainty of survival. Communication between trenches was vital but dangerous. Messengers ran through narrow tunnels or crawled across open ground with dispatches strapped to their bodies. Telephone wires were laid, often broken by shell fire and repaired again within hours. At night, the sky flickered with flares, white and green lights drifting above the battlefield, casting long shadows over the sleeping earth. The trench system also demanded a constant flow of supplies. Everything, food, ammunition, medical gear, had to be carried by hand or mule through the communication trenches. Long lines of soldiers, bent under weight, moved silently through the dark, guided by the faint glow of lanterns or the touch of the man ahead. It was a world without rest, where day and night blended into a single blur of effort. In some sectors, the trenches were so close that soldiers on opposite sides could hear each other talking. They shared the same cold, the same hunger, the same endless waiting. There are stories of brief truces during quiet nights, when voices drifted across no man's land, a song, a laugh, or even a warning about incoming shells. For a moment, the wall between enemies seemed to thin, revealing the shared humanity buried beneath the uniforms. As the war continued, the trench systems became more elaborate: miles of tunnels, underground command posts, storage rooms, and hospitals. Engineers carved deep shelters capable of withstanding heavy bombardment. Some trenches were even wired with electricity, their dugouts lit by small lamps. But for most soldiers, the conditions remained primitive, cold, wet and dark, the mud was perhaps their greatest enemy. It swallowed boots, weapons, even men. Rainwater mixed with shattered soil until it became a heavy paste that pulled everything downward. Rats thrived in it, feeding on scraps and the dead. Lice crawled through uniforms, spreading disease and sleeplessness. Every step, every movement was a battle against the weight of the earth itself. And yet, despite it all, the soldiers endured. They learned how to live with the mud, how to keep rifles dry with bits of oil and cloth, how to sleep sitting up during bombardments, how to make a fire from damp wood, how to laugh at jokes that weren't funny simply because they needed to feel alive. The making of the trenches was not just a feat of engineering. It was an act of collective adaptation. An entire generation learned how to survive beneath the surface of the world. They built, repaired, and defended a landscape that had once been fields and villages but was now transformed into something entirely new. A vast underground city of endurance. When the war finally ended, many of these trenches were filled in or reclaimed by nature. Grass grew over them, trees took root, and the rain washed away their edges. But even now, if you walk through parts of France or Belgium, you can still see faint lines in the earth, the ghostly remains of that once living network. Beneath your feet, the stories of those who dug, fought, and survived still lie buried in the soil. The trenches were born from fear, shaped by necessity, and sustained by human resilience. They turned open fields into fortresses and ordinary men into engineers of endurance. In their darkness, the soldiers learned not only how to fight, but how to endure, quietly, stubbornly, and together. When soldiers first arrived at the front, most imagined combat as swift, decisive, and glorious. A charge across open ground, a battle fought under banners and bugles. What they found instead was stillness, endless waiting. The war of motion had become a war of mud. The trenches, which were meant to be temporary, became their entire world. Daily life in the trenches was a strange mixture of routine and chaos, of boredom punctuated by terror. There was little sense of time. The sun rose and set, but days blurred together in the monotony of orders, fatigue, and the same gray horizon. Everything revolved around survival, not only from bullets and shells, but from cold, hunger, dampness, and exhaustion that a soldier's day began before dawn. The early hours, known as stand-to, were the most dangerous. Both sides feared surprise attacks at sunrise, so every man was ordered to his position, rifle in hand, watching the horizon as the first light touched the wire. The air was cold and heavy, and the silence unbearable. When no attack came, the order to stand down was given, and the soldiers relaxed, though relaxed was a relative term in a place where comfort barely existed. Breakfast followed, if rations had arrived during the night. It was rarely fresh, usually a tin of cold meat, a chunk of bread, and tea brewed from muddy water. Some men saved small luxuries from home, a piece of chocolate, a jar of jam, or a cigarette tucked safely in a tin. These small things meant more than food. They were reminders that somewhere, beyond the noise and the mud, life still continued. After breakfast, the daily routines began. The trenches were living structures, constantly collapsing, flooding, or crumbling under bombardment. Repair work was endless. Men carried sandbags, reinforced parapets, cleared drains, and replaced duckboards. Shovels were as vital as rifles. A day without digging was rare. Those not working on the trenches cleaned weapons, tended equipment, or wrote letters. The one escape from the monotony. Mail was a lifeline. Letters arrived irregularly, often carried through the maze of communication trenches by exhausted runners. A letter from home could lift morale for days. Soldiers wrote back whenever possible, sometimes in short, hurried lines, sometimes in long reflections that poured out everything they could not say aloud. Ink smudged, paper tore, but the act of writing itself, of remembering, kept them human. When work was done, there was waiting. Always waiting. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of distant guns. Some soldiers played cards on ammunition boxes. Others shared stories, songs, or crude jokes. Laughter, even bitter laughter, was a shield against despair. When boredom grew unbearable, some carved wooden trinkets or decorated empty shell casings with intricate designs. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, lost in thought. The weather was an enemy of its own. In winter, the trenches froze solid. Water turned to ice, and men woke with frost on their blankets. In summer, the heat made the stench unbearable, a mix of mud, sweat, and decay that no amount of wind could disperse. Rain was constant. It seeped through coats and boots, pooling at the bottom of the trench. The ground swallowed feet whole, and the mud clung to everything. It was not unusual for men to stand ankle, or even knee-deep in water for days. The result was trench foot, a painful, sometimes fatal condition caused by constant dampness. The skin softened, cracked, and turned gray. Some soldiers lost feeling in their legs entirely. Others required amputation. Officers urged their men to rub their feet with whale oil and change socks regularly, but in practice, it was nearly impossible. Clean socks were as precious as ammunition. Sleep was rare and shallow. The sound of artillery never truly stopped, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to shake the ground. When the guns paused, the silence was even worse, because it meant the enemy might be preparing something. Soldiers learned to doze between shifts, wrapped in damp blankets, lying in dugouts barely large enough to stretch their legs. Many wrote that the best sleep came not from comfort, but from sheer exhaustion. Night brought both relief and danger. Under cover of darkness, supply parties moved through the communication trenches, bringing food, ammunition, and messages. Engineers repaired damage from the day's shelling. Patrols crept into no man's land, crawling through the mud to inspect barbed wire or gather intelligence. The night air was cold, often filled with mist and every sound. A shovel, a cough, a footstep seemed impossibly loud. And yet, despite the constant fear, there was a strange beauty to those nights. The stars above the trenches shone clear and sharp, unspoiled by city lights. Soldiers often wrote in letters home about the stillness between barrages, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, for a few moments, the war felt far away. Food was a constant concern. The army provided regular rations, but they were simple and repetitive: tinned meat, hard biscuits, tea, and occasionally cheese or jam. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare. In some sectors, soldiers trapped rats or traded with locals for eggs and bread. When the weather allowed, they built small fires from scraps of wood and heated their meals in mess tins, though smoke risked revealing their position. The smell of cooking, faint but familiar, offered comfort. Cleanliness was another daily struggle. There were few places to wash. Lice infested every layer of clothing, their bites causing endless itching. Soldiers joked that the lice have rank too, because even officers could not escape them. Every few weeks, men were rotated out of the line to rest areas, small camps behind the front where they could bathe, change clothes, and sleep in real beds. For many, those days felt unreal, like brief visits to another life. Disease was constant. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and spoiled food led to outbreaks of dysentery, influenza, and trench fever. Medical officers worked tirelessly in makeshift dressing stations, but resources were limited. A soldier could be healthy one morning and evacuated by evening. The line between life and death was thin, and everyone knew it. Still, humanity endured. Soldiers celebrated birthdays, holidays, even makeshift religious services in the trenches. They sang songs in groups, their voices echoing down the narrow corridors. One might hear a harmonica, a tin whistle, or the faint rhythm of boots tapping against boards. Humor became a language of survival. Men nicknamed their rats, joked about the mud, and laughed at the absurdity of war. If you didn't laugh, one wrote, you'd cry, and there was no time for that. Companionship was everything. Men depended on each other more than they ever had before. In the trench, differences of class or background meant nothing. The soldier beside you was your world. The one who shared his last biscuit, who woke you before stand to, who helped lift you when you slipped into the mud. Friendships formed that could never be forgotten. Sometimes, even the enemy seemed part of that same tragic brotherhood. During quiet nights, when the guns fell silent, voices drifted from across no man's land. Songs, shouts, or laughter. There are stories of men tossing cigarettes or food across the wire, or of brief truces when both sides agreed to collect their dead. For a few hours, war paused, and the world felt human again. When bombardments came, everything changed. The sky filled with thunder, the ground shook, and the air turned thick with smoke and dust. Men pressed themselves into the earth, ears ringing, mouths dry, hearts pounding. The sound was beyond description, a mixture of crashing, tearing, and screaming metal that seemed to come from all directions. When it ended, silence returned, heavier than before, and yet, after every barrage, the same routine resumed. Trenches were repaired, sandbags replaced, fires lit again. Letters were written, laughter returned. The cycle of endurance began anew. In that repetition, in the endless loop of digging, eating, waiting, and surviving, the soldiers found a strange rhythm. It was not the rhythm of normal life, but it was life nonetheless. One built around small comforts, a warm cup of tea, a clean pair of socks, a photo tucked in a coat pocket, a cigarette shared in the dark. Years later, many who survived the trenches described them with a kind of reverence. They hated the mud, the rats, the fear, yet they also remembered the loyalty, the quiet strength, the way time itself seemed to stop. In that frozen world, they learned what endurance truly meant. Daily life in the trenches was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was quiet heroism, the kind that comes from waking up each day and doing what must be done, no matter the conditions. It was the courage of patience, the bravery of ordinary men living through extraordinary hardship. And as the war dragged on, those narrow ditches carved across Europe became something more than battlefields. They became symbols of endurance, of how, even in the darkest mud, humanity found a way to keep going. If the enemy across no man's land was deadly, the one beneath the soldiers' boots was relentless. The Great War's trenches did not only test courage under fire, they tested endurance against nature itself. The mud, the rats, the endless damp, and the invisible armies of disease were the enemies that never rested, that attacked without sound or mercy, and that no rifle could defeat. The Western Front was a landscape destroyed by its own defense. Artillery shells had churned the soil into a thick, shapeless mess. Fields once covered in crops were now unrecognizable swamps, their rivers clogged with debris and wire. When it rained, water had nowhere to go. It filled shell holes and trenches alike, turning the ground into a slow-moving sea of brown sludge. Soldiers waded through it until their boots filled and their legs went numb. When the rain stopped, the sun baked the surface into a crust, only for the next storm to shatter it again. The mud became a living thing. It swallowed boots, rifles, even men. Soldiers wrote of comrades disappearing beneath it, trapped by suction too strong to escape. Rescue was almost impossible. Anyone who tried to pull another free wrist being pulled down themselves. The earth is hungry, one diary read, and it eats without pause. To fight the mud, armies tried everything, laying wooden duckboards, digging drainage channels, raising sandbag walls. Engineers installed pumps to move water from the trenches into nearby ditches. But the rain always returned, and the ground always won. The pumps clogged, The sandbags collapsed, and the wooden planks rotted under the weight of thousands of marching feet. The soldiers learned to live with it. They stuffed newspaper inside their boots, wrapped rags around their legs, and rubbed whale oil on their skin to keep it from splitting. Still, the damp crept in. Trench foot became one of the most dreaded afflictions of the war. Caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, it began with numbness and swelling, then darkened into infection. Skin peeled away, leaving raw flesh exposed. If untreated, gangrene followed, and the only cure was amputation. Entire battalions were crippled not by enemy bullets, but by water. Officers ordered men to dry their feet and change socks whenever possible, but clean socks were rare, and there was never enough time. In the cold months, men massaged each other's feet just to keep circulation alive, a small ritual of survival. But if the mud was cruel, the rats were merciless. They thrived in the trenches, feeding on scraps, corpses, and whatever else they could find. They grew enormous, some the size of cats, and multiplied faster than anyone could kill them. Soldiers woke at night to feel them crawling across their blankets or gnawing at their packs. In letters, men described shooting them with pistols or smashing them with shovels for sport, though it was a losing battle. The rats always returned. They were bold, unafraid of men or noise. Some even learned to anticipate danger. When artillery began to fall, rats vanished into burrows. Moments later, the shell struck. Their disappearance became an omen. When the rats fled, men knew to brace themselves. In this strange way, the rats became part of trench life. Both hated and strangely respected. Lice were worse. Invisible, endless, and impossible to escape. They lived in every seam of clothing, feeding on sweat and blood. Soldiers called them chats, and delousing became a daily ritual. Sitting in groups, picking through seams with candles, crushing the tiny insects against metal buttons. But no matter how many they killed, they always came back. Their bites caused constant itching and sleeplessness, and they carried trench fever, a painful illness that brought high fevers, aching limbs, and exhaustion lasting for weeks. The smell of the trenches was a world of its own. It was the smell of damp soil, unwashed bodies, rotting food, gunpowder, and decay. It clung to everything: clothes, letters, even the skin. Men could tell where another regiment came from by scent alone. The stench of death hung in the air, for burial was often impossible. Bodies lay half buried in the walls or fields, slowly sinking into the mud. Soldiers tried to cover them with lime or earth, but rain uncovered them again. They lived and slept beside reminders of mortality, too common to fear. Disease followed wherever dampness and decay met. Dysentery spread quickly through contaminated water. With few proper latrines and limited sanitation, the risk was constant. Soldiers drank from puddles when wells ran dry, their thirst stronger than caution. Medical officers did what they could, distributing chlorine tablets, boiling water when fires were possible, but in the chaos of war, prevention was never enough. Rats and lice carried illness from trench to trench, as if mocking the lines drawn by generals. A man could survive artillery, only to fall ill from infection. Some trenches became known not for the fighting that occurred there, but for the sickness that lingered. When a unit was ordered to move forward into a new position, men sometimes feared disease more than enemy fire. Even the air carried danger. The dampness made it heavy, hard to breathe. Smoke from shelling mixed with mist, creating a choking fog that burned the throat. During winter, frost formed on the walls, glittering in the morning light. Beautiful, but deceptive, for it turned every surface to ice. Soldiers slipped carrying supplies, fell into flooded ditches, or cracked frozen mud with their boots until their feet bled that in the rare dry spells. The trenches filled with dust instead of water. It coated faces, food, and letters, turning everything the same dull brown. When the wind rose, it carried the dust like powder, stinging the eyes. Some men wrapped handkerchiefs around their mouths just to breathe. There was no escape from the elements, whether rain or dryness, cold or heat. Each day brought its own test. Yet somehow, through all this, soldiers adapted. They developed habits, small rituals that made the unbearable slightly easier. They learned how to cook with limited rations, using empty tins as stoves. They built makeshift shelves in the trench walls to store letters and candles. They sang when it rained, laughed when rats ran over their feet, and called the mud French chocolate as a joke. These small acts of humor were as necessary as food. Animals shared the trenches in stranger ways, too. Dogs were used as messengers and sentries, their hearing far sharper than any humans. They learned to sense incoming shell fire or creeping patrols, barking warnings that saved lives. Some soldiers kept cats to hunt rats, or pigeons to send messages when phone lines were cut. Even in war, life found ways to coexist. The medical services worked tirelessly to combat the unseen enemies. Field hospitals behind the lines were filled not only with the wounded, but with the sick. Doctors treated trench fever, frostbite, dysentery, and infections with whatever supplies they had. Clean bandages were scarce. Antibiotics did not yet exist. The smell of antiseptic, sweat, and fear filled every tent. Some soldiers recovered and were sent back to the line, weaker but alive. Others never returned. And still, nature showed no mercy. Rain fell without pause. Rats bred without end. Lice spread without boundaries. The earth seemed determined to reclaim what men had stolen from it. The trenches were not only scars upon the land. They were wounds that refused to heal. But even in this desolation, moments of humanity persisted. When the weather cleared and the sun broke through the mist, men came out of their dugouts to stretch, to dry socks, to smoke quietly along the parapet. They watched birds returning to the sky, or butterflies crossing no man's land untouched by bullets. For a moment, they remembered what peace looked like. The battle against nature was never won, only endured. It was a constant negotiation between survival and surrender, between the will to live and the weight of the earth. The mud, the rats, the diseases, all of it conspired to break the body and spirit. But somehow, the soldiers endured. They cleaned their rifles, shared jokes, wrote letters, and waited for the next dawn. And in doing so, they achieved something extraordinary. They proved that endurance is not always about strength or victory. Sometimes it is about standing, breathing, and existing when the world itself seems determined to bury you. In the quiet moments between bombardments, when the sky hung low and gray over the trenches, soldiers found comfort not in weapons or walls, but in each other. The war was loud, but its survival was built on silence, the quiet sound of friendship, the scratching of pens on paper, and the heartbeat of men who refused to forget their humanity. The trenches were not places of glory. They were places of endurance. Men who had once been strangers, farmers, teachers, students, factory workers, found themselves sleeping shoulder to shoulder in the same damp dugouts. They shared everything: food, cigarettes, stories, and fears. Bonds formed quickly because they had to. Trust was not a luxury, but a necessity. You depended on the man beside you not just for companionship, but for survival. They called each other brother, even when they came from different worlds. In the mud, there were no ranks that truly mattered. An officer might share tea with a private. A poet might joke with a miner. When the shells began to fall, all were equal before the earth. The trenches had a way of stripping life down to its simplest truth: the value of another human being. Letters became the thread that connected this buried world to the one above. Every day, soldiers waited for the mailbags to arrive, sometimes carried by hand through miles of mud. When the call came, mail's up, men dropped whatever they were doing and gathered around, eager for a scrap of paper that might remind them they still belonged to something larger than the war, that a single letter could change a man's whole day. The words from home, a wife describing the weather, a mother's prayer, a child's drawing, were more than news. They were proof of life beyond the horizon. Soldiers unfolded them carefully, smoothing out creases with calloused fingers, reading and rereading until the paper nearly tore. Some carried the letters in their breast pockets, close to the heart, until the ink faded from sweat and rain. Writing back was an act of defiance, a way of saying, "I am still here." Men wrote by candlelight, in cramped handwriting, using their helmets as desks. They described the weather, the food, the comradeship, but rarely the horrors. They didn't want to worry those at home. "It's muddy, but we manage," they'd write, though their boots were filled with water. "I'm keeping well," they'd say, though they hadn't slept in 2 days. In this way, the letters became both a comfort and a shield. Between soldiers, communication was simpler, more direct. They spoke without pretense, often without words at all. A shared cigarette could mean more than a speech. A nod during shell fire said everything. When one man was wounded, others carried him without hesitation. When someone fell asleep during guard duty, another stayed awake a little longer. Their loyalty was not written in orders, but in instinct. Friendship in the trenches was immediate and profound. You could meet a man one morning and mourn him by nightfall. The war gave little time for slow acquaintance. Bonds had to grow quickly or not at all. Yet those friendships were among the strongest ever formed. Soldiers would risk their lives for men they'd known for days because in that fragile world, each person was a thread holding the others together. Even humor became an expression of love. Soldiers teased each other constantly about accents, habits, fears, because laughter was their weapon against despair. Jokes about the mud, about the rats, about the food that tasted like cardboard. They laughed because they needed to. In the middle of ruin, humor reminded them they were still human. When letters stopped coming, when a man received no word from home for weeks, his comrades noticed. They shared their own or invented stories to fill the silence. "She must be busy," they'd say kindly. "Mail's slow this week." Hope was a fragile thing, and they protected it fiercely, even with lies. The arrival of Christmas or birthdays brought out an almost childlike joy. Soldiers exchanged small gifts, a bar of soap, a coin, a photograph, anything that could be spared. Some carved trinkets from shell casings or bits of wood. Others made cards from scraps of paper. These small gestures carried meaning far beyond their size. In a world stripped of comfort, the smallest kindness became immense. Music, too, offered escape. Soldiers sang in groups, their voices blending with the rumble of distant guns. Folk songs, hymns, body tunes, anything that reminded them of home. Sometimes they sang to drown out fear. Sometimes simply to hear something human amid the metal and mud. On quiet nights, when both sides rested, songs carried across no man's land, and for a few moments, enemies shared the same melody under the same cold stars. There were poets among them, young men who wrote verses on the backs of ration cards, in notebooks hidden from the rain. They wrote not for fame, but for remembrance. They tried to capture the feeling of waiting, the smell of the earth, the faces of friends who would not return. Their words became the war's quiet conscience, the proof that beauty could survive even in the most broken places. Fear was constant, but friendship softened it. During shellfire, men instinctively moved closer together, huddled shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of the trench. The earth shook, dirt rained down, and they waited, counting the seconds between explosions. Afterward, they checked on each other. "You all right?" Even when the answer was obvious. It was not the question, but the asking that mattered. When someone was lost, grief came quickly and quietly. There were no ceremonies, no speeches. A man's few belongings, letters, photographs, a notebook, were collected and sent home. His name was mentioned at dinner, perhaps with a short silence. Then life continued because it had to. The survivors carried the memory forward in their hearts. Every friendship lost became another reason to endure, another promise to keep breathing. Some soldiers found solace in sharing stories of home. They described fields, rivers, small towns, or the taste of bread from their mother's kitchen. They painted pictures with words, and for a few minutes, everyone listening could almost see it. A world without barbed wire or trenches, a world that felt like memory more than dream. These conversations were not just nostalgia. They were survival. They reminded men of why they fought, of what they might return to. Acts of kindness took many forms. A man sharing his last cigarette with a comrade. A medic working tirelessly through the night, ignoring his own wounds. A group of soldiers carrying a wounded enemy back to shelter. The front blurred the boundaries of good and evil. What remained was decency. The quiet courage to care in a place built for destruction. Mail carried not only words but small treasures. Pressed flowers, photographs, medals, a lock of hair. Some soldiers wore these tokens under their uniforms, close to the skin, as if they were charms against death. Others carried them in their helmets or pockets, touching them before battle. In a world ruled by chaos, these small objects held order. The camaraderie of the trenches lasted long after the war. Many veterans later wrote that what they missed most was not the fighting but the brotherhood, the strange, unspoken bond forged in the mud. No one will ever understand, they said, except those who were there. It was not pride, but recognition. They had shared something beyond language. Something that could only be felt by those who had lived side by side in a world where every day could be the last. In the end, it was not weapons or tactics that sustained them. It was the human spirit, the laughter, the letters, the friendships, and the stubborn will to keep living. They survived because they found meaning in one another. The war tested every part of their being, but it could not destroy the simple truths that made them human. The need to belong, to remember, to be remembered. The trenches may have buried them in mud, but their hearts remained unbroken. Every letter home, every shared cigarette, every whispered word in the dark was a small victory against despair. Each act of friendship said what the war could not silence. We are still alive. We are still ourselves. When the sun set over the trenches, a different kind of war began. The gunfire did not always stop, but even when it did, the silence that followed was heavier than sound. The nights of the Western Front were long, stretching beyond hours, beyond sleep, into something timeless and suspended. They were nights of waiting, of listening, of endurance. As daylight faded, the horizon turned gray, and shadows deepened across no man's land. The last streaks of red disappeared behind the torn silhouettes of trees, and the world sank into darkness. Lanterns were forbidden near the parapet, so men worked by memory, moving slowly, whispering only when necessary. Their boots made soft sounds in the mud, the kind of sound that seemed louder than speech. Darkness brought both relief and danger. The heat of the day cooled, and the relentless shelling often lessened. But it was also the time for raids, patrols, and ambushes. Orders came down in hushed voices. Small groups would crawl out through the wire, searching for information, listening for movement on the other side. Those who stayed behind kept watch, eyes fixed on the black horizon, rifles resting on the edge of the trench. Every flicker of light, every sound of rustling grass could mean an attack. The night smelled of damp earth, sweat, and smoke. The stars shone bright when the sky was clear, brighter than any soldier had ever seen them before. Men often looked up at them during the rare moments of calm, thinking of home. Somewhere, beyond the noise and the mud, those same stars hung over the villages and cities they had left behind. It was a quiet connection, fragile but real. Inside the trenches, the world was smaller. Men whispered stories to keep each other awake, shared cigarettes, or simply sat in silence. Sometimes they played cards by candlelight, their faces half lit by the flicker of flame. Others wrote letters, their handwriting shaky from cold and fatigue. Words flowed differently at night, softer, more honest, shaped by the darkness around them. Fear was ever present, but it came in waves. It was not always terror. Often it was something duller, heavier, the weight of uncertainty. At night, imagination became another enemy. Every creak of wood, every splash of water, every distant thud could be something approaching. The brain, exhausted, filled in the gaps with ghosts and possibilities. Sleep was dangerous because it meant letting go of awareness. Yet wakefulness was a slow form of exhaustion. When artillery fire began after midnight, it shattered the fragile stillness. The sky erupted with flashes of orange, the air shaking with explosions. The ground trembled like a living creature. Men pressed themselves deeper into the earth, covering their heads, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken since childhood. The noise was overwhelming, a storm of sound that seemed to swallow thought itself. And then, suddenly, it would stop. The silence afterward was unbearable. The ears rang, the heart thudded, and the only sound was the dripping of water or the moan of wind through broken wire. That silence, many soldiers later said, was worse than the shelling because it made you listen for what might come next. In some sectors, nights passed without fighting at all. Then, a strange peace settled over the trenches. Men moved quietly through their routines, carrying ammunition, filling sandbags, checking the wire. Somewhere far off, a single rifle might fire, echoing faintly across the lines. In these quiet hours, the war felt distant, almost forgotten. Some men dared to hum a tune or murmur a story from home. The front seemed, for a moment, like a different world entirely, one made of whispers and distant stars, but the stillness was deceptive. The enemy was close, sometimes no more than 50 yards away. The soldiers could hear voices drifting over the night air, or laughter, or the clink of a shovel against stone. Sometimes both sides shouted to each other, insults, jokes, even greetings. "Good night, Fritz," one would call. "Good night, Tommy," came the answer. For a brief moment, the war felt human again. Then, as morning neared, the talking stopped, and both sides returned to silence. Hope was a fragile thing in the trenches, but it was never entirely gone. It came in small, flickering moments, a letter from home, the smell of coffee brewed in a dented tin, the warmth of a shared blanket. Hope lived in the routines, in the quiet acts of care that bound the soldiers together. It was not the loud, blazing hope of victory, but the quiet one of survival, of making it through the night. Many soldiers later said that the night changed them more than the battles did. In the dark, stripped of noise and distraction, they faced their own thoughts. They remembered faces, voices, small details from lives that now seemed impossibly distant. Some prayed softly, not for glory but for safety, for themselves, for the men beside them, for the dawn to come without disaster. Others simply sat and watched the stars, counting them as if they were keeping score against the dark. The long nights also revealed the extraordinary calm of habit. Even under threat, life continued. Men learned to move in rhythm with the war, to rest when they could, to eat quickly, to sleep sitting upright, to wake at the faintest sound. Their bodies adjusted to exhaustion. Their minds learned to shrink the world to what was immediate. The next task, the next hour, the next breath. Every dawn was both an ending and a beginning. The sky lightened slowly, turning from black to gray to pale gold. The outlines of the trenches emerged, sandbags, rifles, the silhouettes of men standing watch. The morning mist rolled across no man's land, softening everything. For a few minutes, before the first gun fired, there was peace. It was fragile, but it was real. Sometimes, that peace broke in tragedy. A sniper's shot, a sudden bombardment, a shouted order, and the day began again in chaos. But for those few moments of stillness at dawn, soldiers breathed freely. Some sipped tea, others simply closed their eyes and felt the cold air on their faces. It was the closest thing to hope they could touch. To survive those nights required a kind of courage different from battle, a quiet endurance, the courage to wait, to feel fear and continue anyway. It was not the courage of charge and action, but of patience and faith. And perhaps that is why, in so many letters and diaries, soldiers remembered the nights more vividly than the days. The darkness revealed not just danger, but the depth of the human spirit, its ability to adapt, to endure, to hope, even in the deepest quiet. Years later, veterans who returned home would describe the sounds of those nights, the distant guns like thunder, the rustle of wind through the wire, the faint murmur of voices below ground. Some said they could still hear it in their dreams. The memory was not one of noise, but of stillness, the feeling of being small in an enormous, indifferent world, yet somehow alive within it. The long nights in the trenches were a test of the soul. They stripped life down to its essence: breath, warmth, companionship, hope. The stars above were reminders of a world untouched by war, of beauty that still existed beyond the reach of guns. For many, those stars became symbols of something pure, untarnished. As long as the stars are still there, one soldier wrote, the world cannot be entirely lost. And so they endured, night after night, through rain and frost, through fear and silence, they endured. Because even in darkness, they carried within them a light, faint but steady, the quiet hope that one morning the guns would fall silent for good. Amid the thunder of artillery and the weight of endless days, there were moments when the world at the front seemed to breathe again. Brief pauses in the storm when the soldiers remembered that life still existed beyond mud and wire. These were the moments of calm, fragile but real, that helped men endure what might otherwise have been unbearable. Even in war, time did not move at a constant pace. Between bombardments and attacks came stretches of quiet that felt like another world entirely. The sound of guns faded to a distant hum. The sky cleared, and the air filled with the smell of wet earth and smoke. Men stepped out from dugouts, stretched their backs, and looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. These were the hours when soldiers tried to reclaim small pieces of normal life. Some shaved, others polished boots, wrote letters, or mended torn uniforms. A few even built makeshift furniture, shelves from wooden crates, chairs from broken boards. Anything that made the trenches feel less like a prison and more like a home. Music was a constant companion. Harmonica tunes drifted along the trench lines, blending with the wind. Soldiers sang softly to themselves or in small groups, their voices low and tired but steady. Sometimes, a man with a violin or accordion would play, and for a few minutes, the war seemed to pause. Even those who did not sing listened quietly, letting the sound carry them somewhere far away. One soldier once wrote, "We sang not because we were happy, but because we needed to remember what happiness sounded like." Laughter, too, was a kind of rebellion. In the mud and misery, humor was a shield stronger than steel. Soldiers joked about everything, about the rats that stole their food, the officers who shouted too much, the endless mud that swallowed boots. They invented songs that mocked the rations or parroted military marches. It wasn't disrespect, it was survival. Laughter kept them human. When supplies allowed, men brewed tea or coffee in small tins over makeshift fires. The faint warmth of steam, the smell of something familiar, was a reminder of comfort. They shared cups, passing them hand to hand, even if there wasn't enough for everyone. The taste was less important than the ritual itself, the act of gathering, of pausing, of being still for a moment in a world that never stopped. There were quieter escapes, too. Some soldiers collected things from the land around them: pebbles, flowers, even shrapnel. They carved souvenirs out of shell casings or polished bits of brass into pendants. These small creations, born from destruction, became personal reminders of endurance. In a place where everything seemed temporary, these tiny acts of making felt permanent. Reading was another refuge. Books were passed from trench to trench, their pages worn thin by many hands. Soldiers read poetry, adventure stories, and newspapers from home. Some carried pocket-sized classics tucked inside their coats. Shakespeare, Dickens, Homer, words that had survived centuries of human struggle and now offered quiet companionship in the mud. The natural world, despite the war, refused to vanish. Birds still flew over the lines. Wildflowers still grew in ditches between shell holes. When the guns fell silent, the sound of insects or the sight of a sunrise could bring a kind of peace that no victory could match. Soldiers noticed these details keenly, perhaps because they reminded them of life's persistence. "I saw a butterfly," one wrote, "and for a moment, I forgot there was a war." Sometimes, men played games to pass the time. Cards, dice, or even improvised competitions. Who could guess how long until the next ration truck arrived, or how many shells would fall before nightfall? These games were small rebellions against despair. They turned waiting into living. Writing was a quiet escape, too. Beyond letters home, many soldiers kept diaries. Some were simple, lists of days and weather. Others were deeply reflective. They wrote about fear, about friendship, about the strange beauty of dawn after a night of shelling. Most never intended these words to be read by anyone else. They wrote to make sense of what they were living through, to build order in a world of chaos. Those who had access to cameras or sketchbooks captured what they saw, not the fighting, but the quiet. The dugouts, the faces of comrades, the sky above the wire. In these drawings and photographs, the war appears still, almost peaceful. The artists did not ignore the horror. They simply sought to remember the humanity that persisted alongside it. Rest came in fragments. Soldiers slept whenever and wherever they could, in dugouts, against sandbags, sometimes even standing up. In those moments of half-sleep, the sounds of war faded into dreams. Some dreamed of home, of food, of silence. Others dreamed of nothing at all, a dark, restful void where even memory was quiet. The rest areas, behind the front, were another kind of escape. When soldiers were rotated out of the line for a few days, they entered a world that felt almost unreal. There were beds, clean water, and food that tasted of something other than tin and smoke. Some wrote that these short rests were more exhausting than the front itself, because they reminded them too clearly of what they had lost. Still, they returned to the trenches with renewed strength, proof that even a brief touch of normal life could keep hope alive in quieter sectors of the front. Where fighting slowed, a strange coexistence developed between enemies. Each side respected the other's need for survival. At night, both dug in silence. By day, they avoided unnecessary shots. There was an unspoken agreement that not every moment needed to be deadly. Soldiers later recalled hearing laughter from across no man's land, or the faint tune of a song that mirrored their own. It was not friendship, but understanding, the recognition that the same endurance lived on both sides of the wire. For some, nature itself became a companion. They learned to read the weather, to sense rain in the air, to recognize the silence that came before a storm. The world had shrunk to the size of their trench, yet it was also vast, filled with small details that kept them grounded. A spider building a web on a bayonet, frost patterns on a wooden beam, the way morning mist rolled across the field like smoke. Each tiny observation was a reminder that life continued, indifferent yet constant. Even in the darkest times, kindness survived. Soldiers shared what little they had: a spoon of sugar, a dry match, a blanket corner. They carried wounded comrades through mud, risked their lives to pull strangers from shell holes. These acts were not heroic in the grand sense, but in the quiet way that endurance becomes compassion. Some nights, when the air was still and the sky clear, men gathered in small groups just to talk. They spoke of the world beyond the war, of jobs they hoped to return to, of families, of the future. There was no illusion. They knew many of them would not see that future, but speaking of it made it real, if only for a moment. The moments of calm in the trenches were not grand or dramatic. They were found in the smallest things: a cup of tea, a line of poetry, a shared laugh, a patch of blue sky after rain. These fragments of peace did not end the war, but they gave it meaning. They proved that even surrounded by destruction, the human spirit could still reach for beauty, still create, still care when the war finally ended. Many veterans said it was those quiet moments they remembered most. Not the battles, not the victories, but the pauses in between. The times when they felt most alive, most aware of the fragile, fleeting peace that exists even in chaos to eye in those moments of calm. The soldiers of the Great War rediscovered something timeless: the strength of stillness, the healing power of connection, and the simple truth that even in the darkest mud, there is room for light. By 1918, the trenches of Europe had become more than battlefields. They were entire worlds of fatigue. For years of war had drained everything: the land, the soldiers, the nations themselves. The mud had been trampled flat by millions of boots. The air hung heavy with smoke, and the sky itself seemed tired of the sound of guns. The war that was supposed to end quickly had stretched into an endurance test that seemed to have no finish line. The soldiers who remained were not the same men who had marched out in 1914. The gleam of optimism had long since faded. The uniforms were patched, the faces lined with exhaustion, and their eyes carried a stillness that only endless waiting could carve. They had learned how to survive, but survival had come at a cost. Sleep was a luxury. Hope was something fragile, whispered rather than spoken. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was one of the hardest. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer. The cold seeped into bones that had known too many winters in the same trenches. Frost-covered rifles, and men woke to find their breath turn to ice. Even fire offered little comfort. The smoke clung low, damp and bitter. But the soldiers endured, because that was all they knew how to do. By spring, rumors began to spread. Some said the war was nearly over. Others dismissed it as wishful thinking. But the signs were there: supply lines weakening, enemy morale breaking, the long stalemate finally beginning to shift. The great offensives that marked 1918, both German and Allied, were desperate efforts to end what had dragged on too long for the men in the trenches. These final pushes felt less like strategy and more like survival. Orders came down to advance, to hold, to push again, and each time, they obeyed, though every step forward seemed to lead only into more mud, more wire, more loss. Artillery thundered day and night, shaking the ground and the body alike. The soldiers were ghosts in uniform, moving automatically, driven by duty more than belief. Many wrote that by then, fear had changed. It was no longer sharp and immediate, but dull, like the ache of an old wound. Death was everywhere and nowhere. Men no longer ducked at the sound of shells. They simply looked up, judging by instinct whether to move or stay. Life and death had become rhythms, part of the landscape itself. Letters home grew shorter. Still alive, some simply said. The words carried more weight than pages of description. The soldiers had seen too much to explain, and their families had read too much to ask. Yet, even in exhaustion, there was a kind of quiet strength, the strength of endurance that had carried them through every frozen night and flooded trench. They no longer fought for glory or even victory. They fought for each other, for the man beside them, for the hope of rest, for the chance to go home. In the final months, the front lines began to move for the first time in years. Villages that had been destroyed were retaken. Roads, long abandoned, filled with movement again. Carts, horses, ambulances, endless lines of weary men. The guns still fired, but there was a new sound beneath them, the murmur of possibility. Soldiers began to speak of after the next battle, after the next dawn, after the war. When the end finally came, it arrived not with triumph, but with disbelief. On November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent. The news traveled slowly along the trenches, whispered from one dugout to another. Some men cheered, some wept, and some simply sat in silence, staring at the empty horizon. For the first time in years, there was no sound of artillery, no shout of command. Only the wind. The silence was strange, almost frightening. Many soldiers later said it felt unreal, as if the war were holding its breath, waiting to begin again. They looked around at the land they had fought over, a landscape stripped bare, pocked with craters and bones, the air heavy with the smell of earth and memory. It was over, and yet it wasn't. The noise had stopped, but the war still lived inside them. The march home was slow. Roads that once led to battle now led to peace, though the meaning of that word had changed. Soldiers passed through towns that no longer existed, through forests reduced to stumps, through fields where nothing grew. Civilians lined the roads, cheering, waving flags, calling them heroes. But the men who walked in those long columns were quiet. Their faces showed not pride, but disbelief, as if they could not yet accept that they had survived when so many had not died in their packs. They carried fragments of the life they had built in the trenches, a photograph, a letter, a worn-out book, a small piece of metal or wood carved during the long waiting hours. These were their true medals, proof that even in the midst of destruction, they had remained human. Back home, families waited, some with joy, others with grief. For every man who returned, another did not. Entire towns were missing names from their tables. The war had not just taken lives. It had reshaped the way people understood life itself. It had shown how fragile peace could be, and how easily the world could fall into silence. For those who survived, normal life felt strange. The quiet of home was unsettling after years of gunfire. The ticking of a clock could sound like distant shellfire, a door slamming like an explosion. Many struggled to sleep in beds, preferring the ground, where it felt familiar. The war had not ended for them. It had simply changed shape, but slowly, life returned. Fields were replanted, houses rebuilt, railways repaired. The soldiers who had endured the trenches began to build again. Families, farms, futures. They carried the war inside them, but they also carried something else, a deep understanding of endurance, of the quiet strength that had seen them through. The Great War left scars on the land that can still be seen today, the faint lines of old trenches, the craters filled with water, the rusted metal buried beneath the soil. But it also left traces in the human spirit, the memory of what it means to survive, to keep going when everything seems lost. The final push was not about victory, but endurance. It was about the simple, stubborn will to see another dawn. The men who fought to the end were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were witnesses to pain, to resilience, to the fragile persistence of hope. When the last soldiers left the trenches, they looked back one final time. The mud was drying, the fires were out, and the fields stretched empty before them. In that silence, they felt both loss and relief, the ending of one life, the uncertain beginning of another. For years afterward, many could still remember the sound of that silence, not the noise of the war, but the quiet that followed it. It was the sound of the world exhaling after 4 years of holding its breath, and though they were tired beyond words, there was a kind of peace in that exhaustion. A peace not of triumph, but of release. The war had ended, but what endured, the patience, the camaraderie, the quiet strength, would remain for the rest of their lives. The Great War ended more than a century ago, yet its echoes still drift quietly through time. The guns have long been silent, the trenches filled, the soldiers gone, but the lessons they left behind remain. They are not lessons of victory or defeat, but of endurance, of patience, and of the quiet resilience that defines what it means to be human. The men who lived and died in the mud did not fight for glory. Most did not even fight for ideology. They fought because the world asked them to, and because beside them stood others who did the same. They endured because they had no choice, and in that endurance, they revealed something extraordinary. They showed that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is found in the man who keeps digging even when his hands are numb, who shares his last bit of bread, who writes a letter when hope feels far away. They prove that humanity can survive even in places where the earth itself seems to turn against it. The trenches, with all their darkness and despair, also became places of light, small, flickering lights of friendship, compassion, humor, and faith in one another. These moments of kindness, these small sparks of warmth, were what truly kept the soldiers alive. The war tested their limits, but it could not take away their humanity. When the survivors returned home, they carried the silence of the trenches with them. They spoke little, not because they had forgotten, but because there were no words big enough to contain what they had seen. Yet in their quietness, they left behind something profound, a reminder that even the greatest suffering cannot erase the will to live, to rebuild, to care. Today, the fields where they once fought are green again. The birds have returned. The poppies bloom each spring. The world has rebuilt itself, as it always does. But beneath the grass and flowers, the earth still remembers, not in sorrow, but in reverence. History often speaks of empires and generals, of strategies and outcomes. But the true story of the Great War lies elsewhere, in the ordinary men who faced the unthinkable, who endured the long nights and cold mornings, who found meaning in survival itself. They were not just soldiers. They were the proof of what endurance looks like when all else is gone. As we look back now, what the trenches teach us is simple, that even in the deepest mud, humanity finds a way to rise. That strength is not always in conquest, but in compassion. That hope can live quietly, like a candle in the wind, and still light the way forward. The war ended, but its quiet lessons endure. Every act of patience, every moment of peace, every gesture of kindness is part of that legacy, a continuation of what they began in the silence beneath the guns. And so, as the night grows quiet and you close your eyes, remember this. From the deepest darkness of history came a light that still burns softly, the memory of endurance. The proof that even through suffering, humanity survives. Sleep peacefully. For the world they left behind was rebuilt not only with hands, but with hearts that refused to forget.